in the journal, and we talk about kind of the ideas behind the studies, the relevance and the rationale behind them, as well as the results. And we are super excited today to have Isaac Yang all the way from a different time zone with us today. And so, Isaac, thanks so much for being on board. And why don't you just jump right in? If you don't mind, we'll kind of interrupt you. People can ask questions from the comments section, and we'll keep it light and loose and listen to what you got to say.
Sure. I just want to thank Randy and Nitesh and Jason in the Journal of Neuro-Oncology, first for publishing our work, and then number two for asking me to come here and just talk a little bit about our paper. And so the paper that we published was the meta-analysis of adjuvant radiotherapy for intracranial atypical and malignant meningiomas. And thank you, Randy and Nitesh. I so hope that this isn't super boring. Well, we're going to talk about meningiomas. And I've spent most of my adult life studying this tumor, and it's one of the most common CNS tumors in adults. Very famous people in the media that have had it. Mary Tyler Moore, Sheryl Crow, you can Google those. It's a common tumor. And we think that they're slow growing and benign tumors originating from arachnoid cap cells. And so we don't always give it all the attention that it probably deserves. But as we mentioned earlier, it's more common in women than men by about 2 to 1. And so hence, Sheryl Crow, Mary Tyler Moore, it's more common in women than men. But when they do occur in men, they're have a higher incidence of being atypical or malignant. And what do we mean by atypical or malignant meningiomas? And if you're not too familiar with the world of meningiomas, they come in 3 flavors. I like to call it the good, the bad, and the ugly. Except Nitesh will say, I don't know what that means. I didn't watch that movie, but I'm old. And there was a movie called The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. And grade 1 meningiomas are the vast majority. Grade 1 are good. These are slow growing. These are benign tumors, and 80% of all tumors of meningiomas are going to be these slow growing benign ones. But about 20% of them are the atypical ones, the more malignant ones. And grade 3, you could just call that cancer. And if these tumors are more likely to occur in women, 2 to 1, but when they do occur in men, we find that there's a slightly higher incidence of these more atypical ones. And this whole paper really started when we were looking at atypical meningiomas. And if you want to talk about atypical meningiomas here on Tumor Talk, and I expect Randy and Nitesh to come at me with like Game of Thrones. I'm gonna talk like Game of Thrones, like swords and fighting and things like that. Atypical meningiomas is kind of like Game of Thrones. It is a intense field. And one of the things that's problematic, whether you like it or you don't, whether you're a pathologist or a radiation oncologist, these are just describing reality, is that the pathologic criteria for atypical meningiomas keeps changing. This is like the third one, at least I know of, in recent memory. And the most recent one was in 2006. And so this paper here called Hitting a Moving Target, Evolution of Treatment Paradigm for Atypical. So this is really the first thing that you got to talk about atypical meningiomas. The target keeps changing. And so historical comparisons are really challenging because before 2006 and before on the previous designations, you're really not talking apples to apples or oranges to oranges. The other thing is the technology is changing so fast, and it's changing faster. Both on the surgical side, when you look at the surgery, and back then it was, here's the microscope, and that was it for a long, long time. And now it's stealth and brain lab and navigation and just the molecular markers. Everything is changing so fast in technology. I mean, even now, you guys are on the East Coast, I'm on the West Coast. When I was a kid, like phone, FaceTime, this is like Jetsons, okay? It's moving so fast. And you may not be familiar, but the radiation side is also moving at a similar clip. And so the technology is changing really fast. And so these are some of the things we wanted to address. And one of the ways we try to exclude, there's no way you can fix the moving target problem, but for our paper, we excluded everything prior to 2000. Okay, you're taking out a lot of historical landmark stuff. I understand. But just to try to keep pace with things are moving so fast that we did this in this paper. So that's one of the things. And let's look at the most current diagnosis for atypical meningiomas. And so you're looking at atypical meningiomas, are 20% of the tumors of these meningiomas, and you have to have an increased mitotic rate. So in plain English, meningioma cells are growing faster, multiplying faster, greater than 4. And then you have to have these other kinds of things on pathologic diagnosis and whether or not this meningioma coming from the outside, from the dura, from these arachnoid cap cells, does it invade brain parenchyma? And that's the current definition. And so this is the definition that's being used. And in all likelihood, I wish it wouldn't change, but it's probably going to change again and make the field difficult. And this is a paper from my good friend Randy Jensen from Utah, looking at the National Cancer Database, the initial treatment for how do you attack atypical meningiomas. And they were looking here, if you can see, radiation and gross total resection, that both gross total resection and radiation probably leads to better overall survival and outcomes in atypical meningiomas. It's like that. And it seems like it's such a silly or simple question, but 15 years ago, when you got a gross total resection on atypical meningioma, yes, it was a different era, it was a different pathologic diagnosis. It was still unclear, what should we do? This is a series from my good friend Manish Aghi at UCSF, and they looked at 108 atypical meningiomas. They did complete gross total resection, and then they did adjuvant radiation versus no adjuvant radiation. And here you can see that about 50% of the no adjuvant radiation group will have recurrence. And so in this series of 108 patients, it's saying, yes, let's go forward and treat them with radiation. And it seems really clear. And this is from Dr. Chen's group, looking at 182. And it's very similar, saying for these groups, in terms of when you get surgery, and in this particular paper, the adjuvant radiation did not affect whether it was gross total or subtotal resection. The radiation had improved outcomes. But despite this, and these are all papers that have come out in the past 10 to 15 years, 15 years ago, I remember sitting and discussing with my colleagues just like this, except Tumor Talk back then wasn't, broadcast all over the world. Back then, Tumor Talk is just grabbing coffee at the AANS or CNS meetings or at SNO, and it was unclear. It was unclear. And if you have a series of 100 patients and 182 patients, is there some way that we can find what the real truth is? And when you look at this literature, all of these studies, most of these studies, my studies from my friends, they're coming from single institutions. So there's a lot of institutional bias. And this is why this kind of thing with Tumor Talk from multiple institutions, UVA, Lenox, Rutgers, UCLA, this is good because you can't see your blind spots. But Randy and Nitesh, they see my blind spots. They see my blind spots well. This is really cool. It's also really hard to reach power for clinical significance. How many malignant meningiomas do you guys see, and do you operate in your practice, in your institution? And we're looking at atypical meningiomas, and those are some big hospitals, and they're reporting series of 100, 200 patients. Really hard to do it. And then the last thing is, if you have really large cohorts, you have big, giant institutions, some of these big, prestigious places, sometimes their data set's so big, it skews the literature. So how do you control for that? And so we looked in the literature, and this is what we found. Literally, you can do this in PubMed. And if you find what this radiation will be like, tumor control rates will range from 20 to 100% in the literature. That's what it is. It's just PubMed. You can do this on your own. And if you do just surgery alone, the tumor control rates are 40 to 80%. It's a smaller range. And this is why, as a field, we are still unclear about, after you do a gross total resection of a atypical meningioma, what do you do? Really, that's the question. And so we were hoping to try to look towards, how do we fix this? And so we did a meta-analysis. We just took all the data out there and we put it together to look at this issue. And I think this is a really good way to look at data. It dilutes the error inherent in any particular study. This study has error, your study has error, every study has error. If you try to put it together, perhaps it'll dilute. It also limits institutional bias. And you can finally get the statistical numbers for clinical power. Our paper looked at over 1,000 patients. You're really getting the best of all the worlds and trying to dilute all the downsides of this. And so this is the publication. You can look at this in the Journal of Neuro-Oncology, published by Springer. And this just came out, and you can look at it for all the specific details of what we did. But just to highlight the keys of what we did, is the first thing is, I've been looking at meta-analyses and systematic reviews for the past 20 years. And what's really changed in the last 5 to 10 years is that, especially in the neurosurgical literature, we're all now trying to adhere to something called PRISMA, preferred reporting items for systematic reviews and meta-analysis, trying to create a standard for how we all approach the data set and how we look at it together and not cherry pick so much, because it's really easy to cherry pick. We had over 1,000 patients, and the median follow-up was a little over 40 years. One of the really key things that we did was we did forest plots for fixed and random effects models. And I'm going to talk about that later in our results about how do you stop the garbage from coming in? Right? How do you stop the garbage? If you're really trying to find the truth in what you're talking about, how do you stop the bad stuff from coming in? And this is a forest plot. If you're not too familiar with what it looks like, is it lists each of the papers and then all of their patients and then the outcomes. And it looks like where's the real effect. And, again, I've been looking at meta-analyses and systematic reviews for almost 20 years now. And one of the most common criticism, my criticism of it, garbage in, garbage out. Garbage papers in, garbage papers out. The literature is garbage and everything is garbage. And I agree. I think if you put garbage in, you'll take garbage out. So you have to be really thoughtful, which is one, we tried to put the barometer and said, look, we're cutting off papers because the historical controls for atypical meningiomas, that just doesn't work. That's one way to do it. But the other way, if you look at the finance, if you look at economics literature, or if you look at public health literature, the way they try to control for this is not to not do meta-analyses or systematic reviews. They use something called the fixed effect model and the random effects model. And I'm going to butcher this. So if you really want to learn this, look at YouTube and Google, the way everyone learns everything in 2021, including my kids. But if I could just give you like a 2-sentence or mini paragraph way of understanding this, a fixed effect model is if each paper and each contribution was held equal. Okay, so if each one of these are held equal, how do they affect the total knowledge? And if I take out one of them, does the whole model still hold true? And so the fixed effect models is going to hurt this paper up here because it's only contributing 2 patients to the effect, and say, well, this is garbage, it's only 2. And then these big elephants that have big series, they're going to dominate the conversation. So that's a fixed effects model way. And the problem is, you could say, well, yeah, that's garbage. And the problem is, you don't know that. Like we say garbage in, garbage out, as if I know what neurosurgical garbage is. And I would just gently suggest that we as doctors may not know. I mean, 30, 40 years ago, doctors used to prescribe smoking in the hospital. We just didn't know that was garbage. And so when you say garbage in, garbage out, I would just say, we don't know. And so just because the paper is small or has a small series, is it garbage? I don't know. And that's what the fixed effects model does. The random effects model looks at it from the other way, which is, yes, each one of these patients are going to be important. And what if they come up along a Gaussian curve and the effects are more different and random and you can't predict them? And so that these 2 patients may be just as equal as 2 patients in this series. And so you're trying to look at it in 2 different ways. Understanding that, we did this in meta-analysis and looked at the overall outcomes and found that radiation after surgery has better tumor control. Here you can see that. And that if you took out any one of these quote unquote garbage papers, and the only garbage paper we're talking about today is mine, okay? That's my garbage paper, okay? But the journal's awesome, but my paper just is garbage. But if you want to say any particular paper is garbage, that's what the forest plot does. If you remove this paper and its contribution, does the overall knowledge, does the overall finding still hold true? So we did this with the radiotherapy, and we found that you had better tumor control versus just the surgical group. If you just attack atypical meningiomas with just surgery, you're going to have a lower tumor control. And if you attack it with PRISMA and over 1,000 patients and looking at fixed versus random effects model, understanding that I don't know what the garbage is, you don't know what the garbage is. If you just dropped off, if one of these papers just disappeared, never existed, with the facts and what we're finding as a scientific literature collectively all together, does it hold true? And what we're finding is that radiation after surgery, without method of gross total, subtotal is probably going to help tumor control. And that's probably the best way to help our patients. And that's what the paper is. Now, if I'm sitting there and I'm listening to this, I'm going to come after this with Game of Thrones. Because even though this seems like a thing that we've just now come to a consensus on, and you're like, oh, there's 15 years worth of data, and there's the meta-analysis, and sounds really good. There's tiny things that, if you're really listening, we're not really sure of. We collectively as doctors, I think we can now collectively say radiation is probably better after surgery. And even now, I know that's a really controversial point. And if you hate me or want to talk with me, come talk with me. That's cool. But even if you agree with me, we don't still agree. Why? Are we supposed to do radiosurgery single fraction, 3 fractions, 5 fractions, 28 fractions? Is it supposed to be SRS versus fractionated radiotherapy after the gross total resection? And then number 2 is, what's the dose? Like in this meta-analysis, if you go and download the paper off the Journal of Neuro-Oncology, Springer, and look at it, you'll see that 54 gray was the typical dosing in these thousands of patients. But 54 gray is probably the best dose for a grade 1 meningioma. Is that the best dose for a grade 2? And so there's still a lot of things to talk about. And then this last one, I actually came up because I was thinking about this and I felt all this pressure coming up to this conversation, was actually gross total resection favors the non-radiation group. If you think about it, let's just stop and think about it. Which kinds of atypical meningiomas are going to have a higher percentage of gross total resections? It's going to be the convexity ones, right? The ones that are convexity on the outside. These are the ones that are going to have better chances of gross total resection. And if you can resect the convexity ones, that should favor the gross total resection group. And yet, our analysis suggests that radiosurgery or adjuvant radiation after surgery will probably improve their outcomes and their tumor controls. And so there's still a lot of issues and problems with the literature and our paper, but this is where we're trying to move the science towards coming to a conclusion. So for atypical meningioma, I think gross total resection has to be goal number 1. Has to be goal number 1. We aren't doubting that or arguing that in any way, shape, or form. The question is, and when this all started with this moving target, should you do adjuvant radiation? And I think our data, our paper, gently suggests that adjuvant radiation probably improves overall survival, progression-free survival, and tumor control. And it suggests that you should probably do this immediately after surgery, irrespective of whatever resection you got. And especially if you get a subtotal resection, you probably shouldn't wait for the tumor to grow. I didn't do this work by myself. This is a picture of the Yang Lab. This is a picture of the Yang Lab meeting during pandemic, which is a bunch of Zoom screens that look like the Brady Brunch. And one of my mentors, Andy Parsa, who started this seed in me, 20 plus years ago, and got me thinking. I'm deeply indebted to everyone listed and everyone pictured here because we didn't do it alone. And then, yeah, it's so cool that this is multidisciplinary and multinational, across the country, but also locally. Everyone that's part of my brain tumor program here at UCLA, I'm deeply indebted to and thankful for. And if you have any questions, hit me up now. If you're old, you can email me. If you're young, you can DM me on the social media. But let's talk. If you want to come after me, let's talk. Because it's probably just all garbage.
We'll find you on TikTok.
Yeah, we got to get you.
I can't go on TikTok because I can't dance.
I know.
I refuse TikTok because I'm just not a dancer. I only dance with my wife, and even then I dance poorly.
Isaac, thank you so much for being a part of this. I love listening to you talk. And so great talk, great study. I think absolutely necessary to look at this. And I think that, like you said, it's difficult to draw firm conclusions from things like this, but they're necessary to put these statements out there because they help advance our knowledge and help come up with questions about what we need to address, right? Because even like the 5 or 6 questions you threw at us at the end, critiquing your own study, basically, those are things that are come out of this. And so, my 2 big questions that I always love asking people is, number one, where do you see the shortcomings in this study? Where from your end of thing, as someone who treats these patients repeatedly, you look at these results and you say, okay, this works. This is my conclusion. What did I miss, or what could be kind of a lingering thing that I didn't really cover? And then number two, the big one is really, does this affect your practice right now? Have you made changes in your own practice based on this information?
Great question. Absolutely. I think I love talking about this. And the thing is, like I mentioned about smoking, right? When we look back, we all kind of giggle and laugh as if it's like, well, duh, right? But back then, those were like good intentioned doctors. And forget the doctors. Like I think about the interns and the residents who were not listening to 80-hour work weeks, like writing like smoking QID with like well-intentioned, right? And 20 or 30 years from now, they're going to look at this YouTube video, this Insta Live, and laugh at Dr. D'Amico, Dr. Patel, and Dr. Yang going, oh my God, like you guys had it wrong too. Even though right now we are going at it with such sincere like hope.
Yeah,
I hope
fervor.
everyone knows that we really want to help our patients.
Yes.
We really love our jobs, and yet we're not getting it so right. And so if you have a look at the big hole, is that none of this is molecularly dated. Like we, some of us have been lucky enough to get the COVID vaccine, mRNA. It's like cutting edge. But when they look at this 20 or 30 years from now, they're going to be like, well, you just look at the mutation. If this one has EMP2 and this one has P53 and this one has, the Lennox Hill mutation, then you radiate. And if it doesn't, you don't. And that's the big gaping hole. That if you step back away from the work and the field and say, man, like this is like really like horse and pony when we should be driving electric cars. The biggest hole I would vent at this and say, look, the future of this is going to have to be not just are we cutting it out and should we radiate it, because that's just really rudimentary. The next level in the future has to be, well, what are the molecular markers? Because as we're showing here in the era of COVID that gets us back to life with mRNA, there are molecular markers here that need to be identified and have not yet been identified in a very rudimentary field. And then number two is, does this affect my practice? I think it does. For me, it has. It changes my personal thing, because I remember being at the tumor board 10 years ago and looking at a gross total resection and saying, well, the literature is 50-50. And it really is what started the whole impetus of looking into this particular. If you really look, you'll see the trail of knowledge over the past 10 years, especially coming out, that I've looked at in meningioma and my lab has published, is that 10 years ago, we did the gross total resection. And I was like, well, I want to radiate, but I don't know if that's the right answer. And, other people are like, well, you got gross total resection, you're probably fine. And just sitting in that uncertainty was like, well, we should figure this out. And what's really cool is all these people have come out with great papers over the past 10 or 15 years, all looking at it. Everyone has looked at it in their own institutions. And I was just fortunate enough to do the statistical analysis, putting it together. But if you look at a bunch of different groups that are listed, and I'm going to miss them if I list them all, but like, the Barrow or UCSF, you're looking at Hopkins, Mass General, you're looking at all these places coming out with their papers and looking at it. They're all looking at with the same good intentions of, let's get gross total resection and see what happens. And I think now that, fast forward 10, 15 years, I think it's pretty clear that most people are on the consensus that radiation after surgery for gross total or for atypical meningioma, or at least for subtotal, everyone would gently probably come to a light consensus that that's the right thing. We don't know, no one's saying it's, black and white, diehard truth, but it's probably the right thing. And what's the exact right recipe? I don't know, but I think it starts with gross total resection if possible. Absolutely.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with everything you said. It's exactly right, exactly how I think about it. And I think the other thing which you also mentioned realistically is the confusion or the discomfort in which treatment paradigm you're going to use, right? So is it diffractionated, or is it proton, or is it gamma knife, or is it are you putting wafers in that radiate? And
I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know. And they're gonna laugh at us in 20 or 30 years because we have it so wrong. But we genuinely don't know, and that's really the whole here is, which is, okay, I think we've finally come to a place where we could say radiation is probably the consensus. And then, and that's why my conclusions are even that is it suggests that you should do immediate radiation. And that's okay if you disagree, But then even if you do agree, there's so many more questions which is really out there for Dr. Patel. And I'm, because I'm old and waning, but the next generation is there. And when they listen to this YouTube and listen to the Instagram live and read the paper, they're going to see that and say, well, we'll carry the baton and come out and be like, you're right, it is proton therapy, or it is fraction. It's actually 13 fractions. You guys had it all wrong. 5 fractions. You guys were smoking back then, and so I'm sure the future, it's so cool to watch it happen.
Very cool.
I've noticed is, and just I'm like 4 or 5 weeks from finishing residency, and just thinking back to their tumor boards when I was an intern or two, compared to now, you can just see the different management styles, even amongst the newer radiation oncologists. Before it would be like, all right, we'll consider radiation. It just goes into the ether and it becomes a forgotten discussion. But absolutely, I mean, this is a fantastic study.
Well, listen, Isaac, we're approaching the 30-minute mark. We like to cut this, keep it short, keep people interested and entertained. And I want to thank you again for coming along. Your contact info is up there if anyone has any questions for you. This will be posted on YouTube for posterity and for forever, so that someone can make fun of us one day about the absurd care we're providing. And come back anytime. And thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you,
everyone.
everybody.
All right, have a great afternoon.
Take care.
Take care.